It began, as many of my missteps have, with a cigarette I wasn't supposed to be smoking. The doctors had made their point, each one a sermon on the perils of nicotine and neglect, but that night Oxford seemed built for disobedience. Rain was still whispering against the window panes, the kind that doesn't cleanse but lingers, softening the edges of stone and sound. I remember the ashtray, an old brass one from a college room clearance, engraved with a crest I'd never managed to identify. The smoke rose in slow, uncertain curls, the sort of quiet that never quite stays quiet. Lewis had gone home early, his wife's birthday, I think, or perhaps I only told myself that to justify the solitude. I'd spent the evening sifting through a file I didn't yet understand about a routine missing persons case from Magdalen College. A junior lecturer, classical philology, 31, described by his students as unremarkably kind. Unremarkable kindness has always made me suspicious. It's rarely honest. The file was in 2 statements, 1 photograph, a timetable of lectures neatly typed on department letterhead. He had left his rooms on a Wednesday afternoon and failed to appear for supper in hall. No bank withdrawals, no calls, just absence. I stared at his face in the narrow photograph with eyes that seemed already halfway to vanishing. Men like that don't run away. They fade, slowly, like smoke in lamplight. I recall walking down to the covered market the next morning, the streets rinsed clean by the night's rain. The city was still half asleep, bicycles leaning like folded bones against railings. I stopped by a cafe near Broad Street, the kind that serves coffee so bitter it feels almost penitential. The girl behind the counter had one of those faces that might have belonged to any decade since 1920, neither modern nor old, only English. She mentioned she'd seen the missing lecturer once, always reading alone, always ordering tea he never finished. I asked if she remembered what he read. She hesitated, then said, softly, "Poetry." And I thought then of how certain people use poetry as camouflage words too beautiful to be questioned. Later, in his rooms at Magdalen, the air still held the faint trace of pipe smoke, though the porter swore he didn't smoke. The desk was perfectly arranged, papers squared, pens aligned, as if he'd gone out expecting to return within the hour. Only one thing seemed out of place, a single volume of Catullus, open face down, its spine cracked at poem 85. Odiat amo, I hate and I love. Why, you ask? I do not know, but I feel it and I am torn apart. I found that line copied again on the back of a college notice pinned above his desk, written in neat, feminine script. Perhaps that was when I first sensed the quiet smoke that lingers behind all academic respectability, the kind made not of tobacco, but of secrecy. There was a small envelope, too, tucked into the second drawer. No name, only the faint scent of lilac and the impression of lipstick on the flap. The handwriting inside was hurried, almost frightened. It spoke of endings of fear, of something that could not be undone. It mentioned Thursday High Bridge and the phrase, "You promised there would be no more letters." I remember setting it back carefully, as though afraid it might crumble. Outside, the chapel bells began their long, unhurried toll. Each note seemed to count something down. I returned to the quad and stood beneath the cloisters. Students drifted past in murmuring clusters, their laughter thin against the damp air. Somewhere, a don was lecturing on moral philosophy. Somewhere else, a lover was lying. And in the middle of all that ancient composure, one man had simply ceased to be. That night, back in my flat, I found myself again with the brass ashtray and a cigarette I hadn't earned. I thought of Catullus and his endless paradox, hate and love, the only 2 true motives in Oxford. I watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling, the shape of a question forming and vanishing before I could name it. Perhaps it was then I understood that disappearances are never sudden. They begin long before we notice the slow withdrawal of presence, a glance unreturned, a book left open. And I, foolishly sentimental as ever, thought I could follow the smoke back to its fire. I remember the fire most vividly for what it did not destroy. It was small, contained, quickly smothered by the efficient panic of porters with buckets and blankets, but in the morning light it felt as though something fundamental had shifted in the air around St. Simon's. Smoke had risen from the ground floor of the Fellows' staircase, curling through the quadrangle like the ghost of a confession. Even the stone looked altered, darkened, humbled, almost afraid. Lewis met me there just past 7. He had that faintly apologetic air he reserved for moments he didn't quite understand, but suspected I did. He said they'd found no one inside the room, only the remnants of papers burned to ash. College administration had already begun its ritual of understatement, a small incident, regrettable, contained. The kind of Oxford phrase that always meant something was being hidden. We stood beneath the archway watching as 2 college men carried out what was left of a wooden chair. Its legs were blackened, brittle. I asked whose rooms they were, though I already knew. The missing lecturer from Magdalen transferred on a temporary fellowship to St. Simon's last term. They said the room had been unused since his disappearance, but someone had been there last night. Someone who had the key, or at least the nerve. The porter was an old man named Greaves, with eyes the colour of cold tea. He kept wringing his hands as if the fire might still be hidden somewhere in his palms. He said he'd locked the quad gates at 10, as usual. No one had entered or left after that, not unless they came through the chapel cloister. He spoke as though the stones themselves could bear witness if only one listened closely enough. Inside, the air was still damp with smoke. Books lay blistered along the shelf, their titles half-consumed Livy, Cicero, a few unrepentant volumes of verse. On the desk, a melted clock sagged like a face in mourning. Yet amid all that ruin, a single object remained untouched, a brass matchbox engraved with the initials ER. It gleamed, absurdly clean, as though it had been placed there after the flames had died. Lewis found a half-burned scrap of paper beneath the grate. He handed it to me like an offering. Only a few words remained of the legible Bridge Thursday promise. The same echo from the letter I'd found in the man's drawer at Magdalen. I turned it over, tracing the edge with my thumb. The handwriting trembled slightly as though written by someone aware they were being watched. Greaves told us one other thing before he shuffled away. He said he'd seen a woman crossing the quad an hour before the fire. Pale coat, he said, and walking quickly, though she carried no umbrella despite the rain. He thought she might have been heading toward the library, but she never came back. There is a peculiar silence that follows fire. It's not absence, but suspension, as though sound itself is reluctant to disturb what has already been consumed. Standing there, I noticed the faint pattern of soot along the skirting board, and unevenness that suggested more than a single point of ignition. 2 fires, perhaps, lit separately. The work of someone making sure that something particular vanished while everything else merely burned for show. Outside, the college gardeners were already sweeping the paths, indifferent to the drama that had passed above their rakes. A bell from St. Mary's carried faintly through the fog, tolling some private hour of reckoning. Lewis muttered about arson, about the need for a statement, but I said nothing. My thoughts were fixed on the matchbox, its initials, its polish. E.R., not the lecturer's. His name had begun with J. I recalled a notice board near the porter's lodge, lined with faded photographs of former fellows. Among them, a woman research scholar in English Renaissance poetry, name beginning with ER. She had left the college 2 years ago, her position abruptly terminated. Rumours had dressed it as academic politics, but rumours in Oxford are never about what they pretend to be. When we stepped back into the quad, the mist was lifting, reluctant and grey. A thin column of smoke still rose from the window, straight as a moral question. I watched it until it dissolved into the colourless sky, thinking how some truths burn clean while others smoulder indefinitely. That afternoon, I carried the matchbox home in my coat pocket, though it was evidence and I should have logged it. It felt wrong to abandon it among the other curiosities of the incident room. It had, in its quiet way, survived the fire. And I suppose I admired that. That night, I placed it on the edge of my desk beside the ashtray. 2 fires in one day, I thought. One intentional, one habitual, both lit by need. I poured myself a whiskey and stared at the matchbox until the room blurred. Oxford outside was silent again, as if nothing had happened, but it had. Something always does behind the hush of stone and Latin and civility. If I've learned anything from Oxford's corridors, it's that women leave quieter traces than men, but traces all the same. You can hear them in the way a porter hesitates before answering a question, or in how an empty room still smells faintly of violets. That morning at St. Simon's, the air was heavy with that kind of silence, not absence exactly, but a residue of presence. Lewis and I had returned to the quad, though there was little more to see. The fire had become yesterday's gossip, and the college resumed its rituals with unnerving efficiency. Students cycled past, gowns flaring like wings, as though scholarship could burn without anyone noticing the smoke. Inside the senior common room, the women of St. Simon's were gathered for coffee. Academics, administrators, a librarian whose spectacles flashed like accusation. I'd been invited politely, reluctantly by Miss Avery, the college secretary. She was the sort of woman who could make silence feel administrative. She said the principal wished to cooperate fully, though one could sense how little she liked the idea of police boots echoing down academic corridors. It was there, in that room of measured civility, that I began to see the case not as a matter of disappearance or fire, but of affection, the sort that festers under protocol. They spoke of the missing lecturer with a blend of pity and restraint. Intelligent, they said, intense, too serious for his own good. The librarian mentioned that he'd once tried to donate a collection of minor Latin poets to the college, but the offer had been misplaced. She blushed slightly at the word. When Miss Avery handed me the attendance log, I noticed a small annotation beside one name, the faint imprint of an erased asterisk. ER again. I asked about her. They said she had left under unfortunate circumstances, something about an internal dispute. No one remembered the details, or rather, no one wished to. The principal described her as a gifted but difficult woman, which in Oxford is another way of saying she had been right about something too soon. Lewis, bless him, tried to sound casual when he asked if ER had known the missing man. The room fell still for a heartbeat. Then Miss Avery replied that St. Simon's was a small community where everyone knew everyone. The kind of answer that says too much by refusing to say anything. Afterwards, walking through the cloisters, I paused beside the notice board outside the library. The glass case was beaded with rain, distorting the faces of old photographs, conferences, summer fetes, the hollow triumphs of scholarship. And there she was again. Her eyes caught the light differently from the others. The smile seemed private, not for the camera, but for someone standing just beyond it. I felt a flicker of recognition, though I could not place her. Lewis asked what I was thinking. I told him about the matchbox from the fire, the initials engraved with too much care to be coincidence. He frowned, said perhaps it was only a gift, something left behind. Perhaps, I said. But people seldom leave behind the things they truly value. We walked toward the river. The rain had thinned to a fine mist, the kind that feels like breath on the skin. Across the water the spires blurred into grey. Lewis muttered that he didn't understand women like those clever ones who seemed half somewhere else. I told him that was the point, they always are. He laughed, uncertain whether it was meant as a joke. That evening I returned alone to the college. The porter's lodge was dark, the smell of polish mingling with dust and old ink. On the counter lay a ledger open to the week of the fire. A single entry written in a different hand, Thursday ER keys returned. It was dated the morning after the disappearance. I stood there longer than I should have, hearing the echo of my own breathing in the corridor. Outside, the last of the daylight drained from the stones. I thought again of the letter that had mentioned Thursday and the bridge and a promise. Bridges in Oxford are never just structures, they are thresholds, crossings, places where people decide whether to stay or vanish. I walked out through the quad, the lamps flickering on one by one. Somewhere, a choir rehearsed voices rising in slow, imperfect harmony. I paused by the chapel door and listened until the music dissolved into the damp. ER had been here. She had returned the keys. She had watched something end, or begun something herself. I couldn't tell which. And as I left Saint that night, I found myself thinking, not for the first time, that Oxford has never been a city for men who love too carefully, or for women who love at all. It was a grey morning in the Bodleian, the kind that made even the books seem to sigh. I had come there without purpose, or at least that's what I told myself. In truth, I wanted to stand among the quiet breathing of centuries and listen for something that might not yet wish to be heard. The missing man had once worked here, cataloguing Latin manuscripts. His signature appeared on half a dozen accession slips thin, unassuming, a scholar's footprint. The librarian on duty, a woman with hair like spun wire and eyes that missed nothing, asked if I needed assistance. I said I was looking into an old case, though I didn't specify whose. She nodded, as if she'd heard that confession before, and disappeared between the shelves. I found his desk easily enough, the sort of small triumph that feels fated rather than earned. It faced a window half obscured by ivy, the glass warped by age into a subtle distortion of the world beyond. On the desk sat a pile of books left untouched since his last visit, preserved by inertia and dust. The top volume was an edition of Catullus, the same poet he'd left open in his rooms at Magdalen. I turned it over gently, as one might handle an injured bird. The margins were neat, almost reverent, except for a single note scrawled in a hurried, unfamiliar hand. Not all promises burn. The words startled me by their defiance. They seemed written in response to something, a quarrel, a plea, perhaps an ending that refused to stay. I stared at the ink until it began to resemble a wound. Lewis arrived some time later, shuffling his feet as if apologizing for the noise. He handed me a report from the forensics team about the fire at St. Simon's had been deliberate, 2 separate points of ignition. I told him I already knew, though I hadn't said so aloud before. He frowned and asked how. Because accidents have symmetry, I said, and this one lacked it. He looked at the open book, the phrase in the margin. He asked if I thought the woman had written it. I said perhaps. Or perhaps she'd only copied it, the way we all copy what we wish were true. He looked unconvinced, but didn't press. We walked later through Radcliffe Square, the cobbles slick with rain, the air faintly metallic with the scent of old water. Lewis spoke of routine things, statements to collect, files to chase, while my thoughts drifted toward that line in the book. Not all promises burn. It was a denial, and denials are always confessions of another kind. I spent the afternoon in the archives tracing her name, E.R., through old correspondence. She had published one paper, forgotten by everyone except the cataloguers, on love and obligation in Latin elegy. The irony wasn't lost on me. I read her prose slowly, hearing the mind behind it precise, unsentimental, but haunted by something personal. She wrote of Catullus as a man divided between devotion and disdain, unable to stop feeling what he knew would ruin him. It struck me, not for the first time, that Oxford rewards exactly that kind of contradiction. The city feeds on those who love too deeply and think too much about it. As I left the library, a porter stopped me. He said he remembered the woman E.R. visiting a few weeks before the fire. She had asked to see her old notes and said she wanted to correct an error in translation. He'd found her sitting at the same desk I'd stood beside that morning. When she left, she seemed calm, though she'd torn a page from one of the manuscripts. That small act disturbed me more than the fire had. Scholars are possessive creatures. They do not vandalize what they love unless love itself has become unbearable. That evening, back in my flat, I laid the photocopy of the marginal note beside the brass matchbox. They looked almost companionable, like relics from the same lost ritual. I poured myself a measure of whiskey, the sound of it, too, loud in the room, and sat watching the rain fall across the glass. I thought again of the phrase and of her hand moving across the page. A note in the margin is never for the reader. It's a conversation without a message to someone who will never read it, or to oneself. Years later, when regret needs translation. Outside, Oxford was dissolving into mist. I wondered how many promises had burned within its cloisters, and how many had endured quietly, written in the corners of books no one opened anymore. And for reasons I couldn't explain, that thought of something surviving, however faintly, felt more dangerous than the fire itself. It was Lewis who noticed it first, though he didn't understand what he'd found. He handed me the photocopy of a letter taken from the missing man's college correspondence, his finger smudged with ink. Something about it had struck him as odd, though he couldn't say what. I looked down at the lines scrawled near the end. A quotation meant, I suppose, to sound cultured. Love that moves the sun and other stars. It was attributed to Dante, which was not wrong. But the phrasing of the rhythm was slightly off, a translation I'd seen only once before. It took me a moment to recall where, a poetry competition, years ago, organized by the English faculty. The winning entry had used that same translation. The author, I remembered, had been E.R. I said nothing to Lewis. Some recognitions are better left unsaid until they've finished forming their shape. Instead, I told him to look into the archives of the competition to find the submission if it still existed. He looked puzzled but agreed, muttering about the odd directions my thoughts often took. I didn't tell him that poetry, like murder, is always about possession. Later, I walked through Christ Church Meadow. The city was blurred at its edges as though seen through a film of gauze. I'd always thought autumn suited Oxford best, the season of retreat, when the light gives up without complaint. I stopped by the river, the wind stirring the pages of the report I carried. The letter had been written on college stationery, but the ink was different from the man's usual hand. Someone had copied it or dictated it. Someone who wanted the words to sound learned, even intimate. That afternoon, I returned to St. Simon's and asked to see the man's old tutorial notes. They were kept in the departmental cupboard, filed with weary precision. His handwriting was spidery, careful, betraying a mind that doubted its own authority. And there, near the back of one folder, I found another quotation, the same line from Dante, this time correctly rendered in the original Italian. Amor c'è, move il sole e l'altre stelle. Beneath it, in small script, he had written a single word here. The deduction was quiet, inevitable. A man quoting a poet twice, once in his own language, once in another's, that's not scholarship. That's dialogue. In the evening, I stopped by the college pub, the one the dons pretended never to frequent. The barmaid remembered both the lecturer and the woman, said they'd sat together often, speaking little, but with the intensity of those who know every silence between them. She recalled once hearing him recite a line about stars, and the woman laughing softly, correcting him. A misquoted poet, she called him. When I left, the air smelled faintly of smoke again, though the fire at St. Simon's had long since cooled. I walked along the High, the lamps casting their yellow pools like punctuation marks on the wet stones. I thought of that phrase, love, that moves the sun and other stars, and how it had travelled between them, shifting shape each time, losing accuracy but gaining something else. It was not a scholar's error. It was a message. Back in my flat, I laid the letter beside the earlier note from the Bodleian, the one that said, "Not all promises burn." I traced the handwriting with my finger, comparing the curves and pressure. The same hand had written both, though one had tried to disguise itself. But the disguise was imperfect. The way she formed her R, a small upward flick at the tail, betrayed her. Lewis called shortly before midnight. He'd found the competition file. The winning entry was titled After the Fire. It had been withdrawn before publication, the author leaving no forwarding address. I thanked him and hung up. For a long time, I sat listening to the rain tick against the window, thinking of all the ways people misquote love, not to deceive, but to survive. Perhaps that's what she had done. Taken his words and made them her own, changing their shape to fit her meaning. The city outside was asleep, its towers faintly luminous in the mist. I closed my eyes and murmured the line again, half aloud, testing the balance of its translation. It was still wrong, but sometimes wrongness carries more truth than accuracy ever will. It was numbers, not words, that finally disturbed the calm facade of St. Simon's. I've always trusted numbers less than people. They hide their deceit behind the illusion of precision. The bursar, a man named Pell, had summoned me to his office under the pretext of cooperation. His voice, when he greeted me, carried the polite fatigue of someone who has balanced too many columns of regret. The office was immaculate, as though even dust had to apply for permission to settle there. A ledger lay open on the desk, a vast leather-bound monument to order. Pell said he understood the police required full transparency. His eyes, small and exacting, suggested otherwise. He pointed to an entry dated 6 months before the lecturer's disappearance, a disbursement marked Research Stipend, ER. The sum was modest, but it was the notation beside it that caught me, the faint, almost erased correction. Originally written as endowment renewal, then changed. I asked if such amendments were common. Pell adjusted his spectacles, saying clerical slips occurred from time to time. But the ink told a different story. The correction was recent. It gleamed faintly under the light, betraying its newness. Lewis, seated near the radiator, tried to look interested, though accounting had never stirred his soul. Pell droned on about funding structures and discretionary awards, yet amid his bureaucratic piety a phrase escaped him that she, ER, had been paid out quietly. I asked what that meant. He looked down, shuffled papers that no longer needed shuffling. It was a gesture of retreat. After he'd gone to fetch a file, I studied the ledger again. The handwriting that made the amendment didn't match Pell's own. The descenders of his eyes were neat, self-conscious. The correction bore a hurried hand, curved, fluid, feminine. Outside, rain was pooling in the quad, the kind that collects old reflections. I lingered there while Lewis took notes. He muttered about administrative cover-ups, but I was thinking of something smaller, more intimate. Someone had wanted to change the narrative of a payment to disguise generosity as bureaucracy. Later, over coffee in the refectory, Lewis asked whether I believed the bursar complicit. I told him no, at least not willingly. He was too dull for intrigue, but dull men often hold the keys without knowing. I recalled a phrase from the missing man's diary that had puzzled me before. Her kindness is always disguised as duty. At the time I'd taken it for metaphor. Perhaps it was arithmetic. In the evening, I returned to the college alone. The corridors were hushed, the air thick with the scent of wax and damp wool. I found the bursar's door ajar, the lamp still burning. On his desk lay a pile of receipts, each marked for disposal. One caught my eye, a cheque stub made out to a florist on the high street. The handwriting was the same as on the ledger amendment. There are few acts more revealing than the way a person writes another's name. The curve of an R, the pause before a second initial. ER appeared again, written not as a bureaucratic code, but as an afterthought, delicate, almost tender. It was then I understood the bursar's arithmetic wasn't merely financial. Pell returned, startled to see me still there. He said he'd been meaning to send that old paperwork to archives. His voice was too quick, too eager. I asked him whether he had known her well. He hesitated, then said something about admiration, respect, a certain fondness that all scholars felt for brilliance. But his tone betrayed an ache, the way one speaks of a melody half remembered. When I left, the chapel bells were sounding compline. The night air tasted of iron and memory. I walked past the quad, counting the windows still lit 12, and wondered whether numbers ever brought anyone peace. Back in my flat, I opened my crossword, an old ritual for thinking without pretending to. One clue stared at me, hidden in plain sight. 7. The answer came immediately obvious, almost mocking. Invisible. It was not the missing man who had been invisible all this time, but the woman. Her handwriting, her amendments, her quiet generosity, all erased under the arithmetic of men. I poured a whiskey and stared at the rain streaking down the glass, dividing the city into blurred sums. I wondered whether love, too, could be balanced on a ledger loss on one side, longing on the other, and whether, in the end, it ever truly came to zero. She was standing by the river when I found her, though found is too deliberate a word. It was more as if the city, in one of its quieter mercies, had allowed our paths to cross. The light was thinning, and the air smelled faintly of wet reeds and smoke from the boats moored along the bank. She wore a pale coat, the colour of evening itself, and she was looking at the water with the stillness of someone waiting to be judged by it. I said her name softly, and she turned not startled, but weary, as if she had already rehearsed this moment. E.R. I had imagined her differently, sharper, perhaps, or colder. Instead, she looked like someone who had learned how to carry sorrow gracefully. She asked how I had found her, and I said it was the bursar's arithmetic that had betrayed her, though in truth it was the handwriting. She smiled faintly. I had always been careless with numbers, she said. We walked along the towpath. The city's spires were dissolving in the mist, and each step made a sound like a decision. She spoke of the man, the missing lecturer, with a detachment that was almost tenderness. He had been brilliant, she said, but fragile in the way Only pride can make a person fragile. They had met in the library, two scholars circling the same text, until the text itself began to resemble confession. She laughed quietly at that, though there was no amusement in it. I asked if she had written the letter that mentioned the bridge and the promise. She nodded. It had been meant to end things, not begin them again. He had begged her to meet him one last time by the river, and she had gone foolishly. She said they'd argued about truth, about duty, about the way love ruins the very things it touches. When she walked away, he was still standing on the bridge, and the water beneath was dark but calm. Lewis would have interrupted then, asked the obvious, did she see him jump? But I didn't ask. I knew she wouldn't have watched. Some endings demand distance. We stopped near the weir. The roar of the current made words unnecessary. She reached into her coat pocket and drew out a small envelope, creased and damp. Inside was a page torn from a notebook of the missing man's handwriting, neat and deliberate. It contained a single line from Catullus: "Why can write nothing truthful about love without also writing of death?" She asked whether I thought it was a confession or a farewell. I told her that in Oxford the two were often indistinguishable. For a while we stood there, the river moving between us like a thought that refused to settle. I noticed the gloves in her other hand, darkened at the fingertips with what looked like soot. She saw me looking and said she had gone back to his rooms the night of the fire. She had meant only to collect her letters, to erase her part in his absence, but the sight of his books, his orderliness, his absence had undone her. A candle had tipped. The rest, she said, was a clumsy accident. I believed her, though belief in my line of work is a luxury. There was something too precise in her regret to be invented. She asked what would happen now. I said that depended on what she could live with, not on what could be proven. She seemed to understand. As we turned back toward the bridge, a boat drifted past, its lantern reflected in the dark water. One small, trembling light divided endlessly. She asked if I ever found peace in my work. I told her that peace was a kind of cowardice, and that I preferred the ache of understanding to the comfort of ignorance. She said that sounded lonely. I said it was. When I looked again, she had stopped walking. The mist had thickened, and her figure was already fading into it. She lifted a hand, a gesture that might have been farewell or forgiveness, or neither, and then she was gone. I stood by the river until the last light bled from the sky, listening to the quiet persistence of the current. Somewhere beyond the weir, a church bell marked the hour, its sound carrying over the water like the echo of an unfinished conversation. And I thought then, as I still do now, that Oxford is full of people who mistake disappearance for freedom and love for something that can be survived. There are evenings in Oxford when the air itself seems to be solving something. That night I sat in my flat with a crossword half completed, a glass of whiskey beside it, and the faint hum of rain against the window. The case, though nearly closed in the formal sense, refused to be quiet. It had the shape of resolution, but not its sound. Lewis had gone home hours earlier, content with the report we'd drafted: accidental death, emotional distress, a tragic misunderstanding of fire and fear. The words sat too neatly together like an equation that balanced only on paper. I told myself it would do, and yet the clue on the page before me kept insisting otherwise. The crossword's definition read, "Truth concealed within the telling nine." I stared at it for a long time. Then I saw confession. 9 letters, fitting perfectly. It was almost cruelly apt. I thought of the letter she had handed me by the river, the one written in his hand but meant for her. and of her own, later found in the burned desk drawer at St. Simon's, written in a script that trembled between guilt and longing. Two confessions, neither quite true, each trying to protect the other. I have never trusted confession as an act. It suggests courage, but it is almost always vanity. People confess not to be forgiven, but to keep control of their story. The clock struck 11. Somewhere beyond the window, the city exhaled, bicycles rattled home. The bells at St. Aldate's gave a single note, like a sigh. I thought of her walking along that same river path after we spoke, the mist swallowing her figure. There had been a calmness in her that unsettled me, as though she had already written the final clue and was waiting for me to catch up. Earlier that day, Lewis had brought me a new piece of evidence, an old library card recovered from the missing man's wallet. The signature on it was his, but beneath it, faintly penciled, another hand had written "E returns." At first, Lewis thought it was a note of possession, something about borrowed books and due dates, but I noticed the absence of punctuation, the way the phrase could mean not E will return, but E returns as in vengeance, or consequence. Grammar is a mirror of intent. One comma can decide whether a sentence accuses or forgives. It reminded me of a line from a sermon I'd heard long ago in the chapel at Exeter, that sin is merely a confession written too late. By midnight, the crossword was finished except for one corner, a clue that read, "Love's residue 4." I tried ash, then mark, then scar, each too easy, too declarative. Finally, I left it blank. Some puzzles are meant to remain unsolved, if only to remind us that meaning is not the same as closure. The phone rang once and stopped. It was late enough that silence felt like a reply. I poured another measure of whiskey and opened the small envelope she had given me by the river, the one I'd promised not to read unless she failed to appear again. I broke the seal. Inside, only a torn fragment of a letter, his handwriting again, the same firm control of line, the same unnecessary neatness of men who believe paper immortal. It read, "If I vanish, tell her it was a choice, not despair. No signature, no date, just that." Lewis would have asked if it changed anything. I suppose it didn't. The facts remained: a fire, a body identified only by absence. But I knew then that choice, not despair, had been hers. I folded the paper, placed it beside the crossword, and stared at both until they blurred into one another, the clean grid of logic and the mess of emotion it tried to contain. The difference between a confession and a clue, I thought, is only that one demands belief, while the other invites interpretation. Outside, the rain softened into drizzle. I wrote one last word into the crossword's empty square echo and set down my pen. It fits, of course. 4 letters, understated, inevitable. Love's residue, indeed. I sat there for a long time after that, listening to the faint hum of the city through the glass and thinking that perhaps all the confessions we ever receive are only echoes of the lives we almost lived, the truths we almost told, and the people we almost forgave. There are rooms in Oxford that seem to breathe deceit as naturally as others breathe dust. The old library at St. Simon's was one of them, a place where silence had learned to defend itself. I remember arriving late in the afternoon, the air dense with the smell of damp vellum and the faint metallic tang of rain on leaded glass. Lewis had gone ahead, his footsteps muffled by the carpet runner, while I lingered in the threshold, reluctant, as though crossing it might oblige me to believe everything that had been hidden there. The librarian, a woman whose age seemed interchangeable with the shelves she tended, guided us to the back room where the restricted archives were kept. She spoke in a tone designed for confession, quiet but self-important. She said E.R. had been granted special access to a collection of private letters, Renaissance correspondence between poets and patrons, and that she had been the only one to request them in years. The missing man's name appeared beside hers on the borrowing slips, paired again and again like a recurring sin. Lewis examined the logbook, his pencil tapping in rhythm to thought. He said something about coincidence, about the collegial sharing of resources. I said nothing. Some patterns don't emerge by chance. They form because two people want them to. The librarian, sensing my distraction, mentioned another curiosity. Some of the borrowed letters had been returned not in their original order, but rearranged, dates altered, sequences inverted. She had noticed only because the numbering on the envelopes didn't align. I asked who had returned them. She hesitated, then said she couldn't recall. The memory seemed to trouble her more than she wanted to admit. She thought it had been a man, then again perhaps not. I asked to see the collection. She fetched it reluctantly, her hands trembling slightly as she unlocked the cabinet. Inside were two neat bundles, tied with faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the outermost letter caught my eye, not the Renaissance scribes, but something newer. Penciled faintly in the margin, she lied. The handwriting was his. Lewis looked at me questioningly, but I said only that the human instinct for annotation is rarely innocent. I unfolded the letter, scanning the Latin text of a poet writing to his patron about betrayal, about the impossibility of reconciling love and truth. In the margin, another note, this one hers. He didn't understand the poem. The words were delicate, defensive, written in a different pencil, the loops of the R matching the ones from her notes at the Bodleian. A conversation between lovers disguised as scholarship, carried out on the parchment of the dead. That, I thought, was the real library of lies, not the books, but the people who used them to speak when honesty was unbearable. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him it meant they'd stopped writing to each other long before the fire and had started writing through the poets instead. As we left, the librarian followed us to the stairs. She said something curious then, almost to herself, that the woman, E.R., had once returned alone one evening, asking whether old borrowing slips were ever destroyed. When told they were archived permanently, she'd gone pale and murmured that some histories should be allowed to burn. Outside, the rain had started again. The college lawns shimmered like wet glass. Lewis muttered that he didn't envy scholars their attachments. I said that love was simply research of another kind of endless footnotes, no conclusion. That night, back in my flat, I spread the photocopies of the annotated letters across the desk. Their margins formed a pattern of fragments of quarrel and apology, of misunderstanding elevated to myth. But one annotation caught my eye more than the rest. It was hers, written faintly on the verso of a letter she hadn't borrowed. He hid the truth where it could not be footnoted. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept turning the phrase over in my mind as if it were a clue half disguised as poetry. And perhaps it was, for there are two kinds of libraries in Oxford, the ones built of stone and catalogues, and the ones we build in one another. Both preserve lies with equal devotion, and both, in their own way, burn when we leave them unattended. When dawn came, the light touched the stack of papers on my desk, pale and unforgiving. I realized then that every case I've ever solved has ended the same way, not with justice, not even truth, but with words, carefully arranged to make sorrow seem logical. And perhaps that is what investigation really is, the endless rearranging of borrowed letters, trying to make sense of what people dare not say outright. There are few things more unsettling than a book returned to the shelf it once left. That morning, the porter at St. Simon's had called to say an anonymous parcel had been delivered to the library. No address, no note, just a small brown package with the college crest embossed faintly on the wax seal. I arrived before the rain had stopped, the cobbles still wet enough to mirror the sky. Inside the library, the light was a weak, apologetic gold. The librarian, that same careful woman of brittle composure, placed the parcel on the desk between us as though handling something sacred. The paper had darkened with moisture at the edges, and when I unwrapped it, a faint scent of smoke escaped the smell of the fire that had started everything. It was the missing book, the Catullus, the one he'd left open on his desk the day he'd disappeared. It looked untouched yet altered, the binding restitched, the spine reinforced. Inside, between pages 84 and 85, a single sheet of modern paper had been pressed flat. On it, in her unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "The poem is complete." I don't know why that frightened me more than anything else. Completion implies ending, and endings in Oxford are never what they seem. I asked the librarian who had received it. She said no one had seen the courier, only found it waiting on the steps after dawn. A delivery without a sender, a confession without a voice. Lewis arrived soon after, shaking the rain from his coat. He said the river patrol had found something upriver, a woman's coat tangled in the reeds near Folly Bridge. Pale wool, empty pockets, nobody. He looked at me for a reaction I couldn't give. I told him to have it logged, quietly. Oxford has always been good at burying what it cannot understand. When he left, I opened the book again. The margins, once filled with their quarrelling annotations, had been carefully erased. Only faint ghosts of graphite remained, like half-remembered arguments. I held the pages to the light, and something caught my eye, a faint indentation where a line had once been written and rubbed out. Tilting it closer, I read what lingered in relief. He never finished translating the final poem. That was untrue. I had seen his translation myself, copied in his notes from the Bodleian. But perhaps that was her meaning, that he had finished the poem in one sense and left it incomplete in another. Love, in the hands of the learned, always disguises itself as scholarship until it burns the paper beneath. I traced the erased words with my thumb, and for a moment the silence of the room became unbearable. There is a particular stillness in libraries after tragedy, when even the air seems to fear turning a page. Later, walking through the quad, I noticed the gardeners removing the last of the frost-blackened leaves from the flower beds. The world, indifferent as ever, was resetting itself. I thought of her by the river, her calmness, her soft voice when she'd said she only wanted things to end quietly. I had believed her then. Perhaps that was my mistake. That evening, I sat at home with the book beside me on the desk. Its presence felt companionable and accusing all at once. I poured myself a whiskey and opened the crossword, more out of habit than hope. The clue that caught my eye read, "Returned, yet changed, 6. The answer came at once. Rebound. It made me smile, briefly. The book had been rebound, yes, but so, perhaps, had she, or I. As the night drew on, the rain began again, soft, persistent, the kind that makes the world sound newly written. I turned back to the book, to the line that had begun it all, Odi et amo. I hate and I love. The ink had bled slightly over time, the letters fading at the edges, as though the words themselves had been weeping. I closed the volume gently and returned it to my shelf. There it sat, among other relics of other cases, indistinguishable to anyone but me. A reminder, perhaps, that restoration is only another form of concealment. Before bed, I caught my reflection in the window, tired, blurred, almost spectral. Behind me, the shelves stood like witnesses. Somewhere in that quiet, I heard the faint echo of her voice, calm and resigned, saying again that the poem was complete. And perhaps it was. Or perhaps it was merely paused, waiting as all unfinished loves do between one translation and the next. It was months later before I allowed myself to revisit St. Simon's. The fire had long been repaired, the stonework scrubbed, the smoke repainted out of the walls. But Oxford remembers differently from other cities. It keeps its scars beneath polish. I walked through the archway as though entering a dream I had half abandoned, the sound of my own steps the only testimony left to what had happened there. Lewis had said I was sentimental to return. Perhaps I was, but cases, like books, rarely end where they should. They close themselves mid-sentence and leave you to finish the thought alone. The library smelled the same as a compound of candle wax, paper, and history. On the desk near the window lay the restored Catullus. Its binding gleamed faintly, the spine unbroken, the kind of perfection that conceals every prior wound. I traced the leather with one finger, half expecting it to pulse. I asked the librarian whether anyone had claimed it. She said it had been catalogued anonymously, donated back to the college under the note for preservation, not possession. The phrasing caught me. Preservation is never about the object, it's about the guilt of letting it burn. I stepped outside again. The air was sharp with winter. Across the quad, the chapel bell marked the hour, slow, meditative, indifferent. Students hurried past, clutching their books like small, private salvations. None of them knew that in this same courtyard a man had loved too quietly and a woman had tried, unsuccessfully, to unlove him. Lewis had once asked me what fire really does. Destroys, yes, but incompletely. It edits. It leaves only what it cannot consume. Char, ash, memory. I thought of that when the report came back months ago, the one listing what had survived the blaze, a brass matchbox, a corner of paper with Latin still legible, and the spine of a book unburnt. The rest had gone cleanly. That night, alone in my flat, I opened my crossword again. The clue that waited for me read, "Remains of passion." 5. I wrote ash, and then, uncertain, crossed it out. Too simple. The answer should have been something plural, something that still moved. I tried trace again. It fit, barely. Later, I found myself at the river without quite deciding to go. The banks were crusted with frost, the water thick with reflected light. Folly Bridge stood ahead, the arches like ribs. I remembered her standing there the first time, her voice calm when she spoke of promises and endings. She had said she wanted things to be quiet. They were, but not kind. A small plaque had been fixed to the railing since then, a memorial, perhaps. No name, only a line of verse. Love survives in the air it scorches. I don't know who placed it there. Oxford has its way of granting anonymity to devotion. I leaned on the railing and watched the water slide beneath, dark, obedient, endless. The city behind me pulsed faintly with light lecture halls, pubs, lonely rooms of scholars pretending not to hear their own hearts. And in that reflection I thought of her once more, the precision of her handwriting, the sadness in her corrections, the faint tremor of her gloves, the night of the river. For years afterward, whenever I passed a library, I would glance instinctively toward the shelves where Catullus might rest. Each time it seemed to have shifted slightly, as though rearranging itself among its peers. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps all books, like people, seek new positions after fire. There's a certain peace in knowing that truth never stays intact. It warps under heat, under time, under the burden of remembering. The man was gone, the woman presumed the same, but their words erased, rewritten, restored, had outlived them both. And I, their unwilling witness, had done nothing more than catalogue the remains. When I returned home, I poured a final whiskey and left it untouched. Outside, the rain began again, gently this time, as though trying to rewrite the night. I sat by the window and watched the city dissolve into its own reflection. The crossword lay open beside me, the half-finished clue still waiting. Remains of Passion 5. I didn't fill it in. Some answers, I've learned, prefer to stay incomplete.